all the stuff that was hard and sweaty was the stuff I kind of had to get through to get to the thing I really wanted to do, which was have these conversations and then share them, because that's my other favorite thing. It's like, I love learning. And then once I learn something, I immediately want to turn and share it with people, because I think it just makes the learning more fun and exciting. The very first episode I recorded, and I was just, I'm using air quotes here, testing my audio equipment with my husband. I ended up releasing it just because I'm like, well, how can I talk about the messy middle and not share this? That would feel a little fraudulent.
Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you. I am so excited for you to meet my incredible friend, Danielle Ireland. She is the host of Don't Cut Your Own Bangs, which, I mean, that title, really, come on. That's an incredible title for a podcast. And she is all around a just incredible and insightful person. I love being connected with her. I love having deep conversations with her. All around, just an incredible human being. And so I cannot wait to share her knowledge as a podcaster in getting to 100 episodes, what that looked like, why she started in the first place, and how she started a bit messy with her podcast, and how that allowed her to push past the fear, to learn, and to become the incredible podcaster that she is today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Danielle Ireland to the podcast. Hello, Danielle. I feel so honored, but also I'm so stinking excited that you're on the show today. If you could just start by telling everyone who you are, what you do, and about your podcast.
I would love to answer all of those questions. So yes, my name is Danielle Ireland. What I do, I work as a therapist, a psychotherapist by day. By night, I have a podcast called Don't Cut Your Own Bangs. And it's the remedy to comparison and feeling like everyone has life figured out but you. It's not podcast therapy. It's like therapy light. So we talk about therapeutic concepts, emotions, and feelings, but I'm not diagnosing anybody, and we're not getting into like the trenches of our shame pits. we're kind of like, we have our arm floaties on and but we're having real conversation.
So you just hit 100 episodes. First of all, like, let's get a kazoo sound or something. No, don't. Kazoo sounds are annoying. You're a parent, you know that. But yay, oh my gosh, incredible. We've been having a lot of people on lately who have like hit that 100 or 150, and it's like a lot of our listeners tend to be in the beginning stages, and they're either like, I don't know what to do with my hands with this podcast, like what do I do? And I want to bring like a lot of encouragement to them, especially from those who have hit that 100 or 150, and show a little bit behind the scenes that it isn't easy and that you tend to want to give up at some point. So what did that look like starting the podcast for you?
Yes. Oh my goodness. To anyone listening who thinks, well, that, like whatever that comparison story is for you about someone who's hit a goal that you hope to hit, but you don't feel like you're there yet. I feel that so deeply. Before I answer your questions, I'll also just add that I don't know if there's ever a stage where you outrun or outachieve that feeling, because there's always going to be a new bench and another goal that sometimes, honestly, it's rare that having opportunities like this to reflect and to appreciate something I've done in this way. Like this, you've given me such a gift, honestly, by allowing me space to talk about it on this podcast, because reflecting in this way, I'm focusing more on the 5 things that I haven't done than this. So thank you for that. But to answer your question more specifically, so I started the podcast. Well, I'll say the idea came January 2018. And I remember that because I was in a workshop to basically like design your year, right? It was like design your life. It was some kind of coaching thing. And I went not expecting to feel different, but also wanting to feel different, which is probably how people end up in lots of workshop self-improvement type things. You're like, I know I want to feel better, but I don't really want to do, and I don't know how I'm going to do anything. But I went, and they asked us to like write down on a piece of paper, what's one thing you want to accomplish this year? Without thinking about it, I wrote, I want to have a podcast. And then as soon as I wrote it, and this may sound obnoxious to someone who's struggling to figure out the name of their podcast, like I can just tell you for myself, as soon as I wrote down that I wanted to have a podcast and it will be called Don't Cut Your Own Bangs, was the very next thing I wrote, like didn't skip a beat. It just came. I wrote it and it was funny to me. Like I remember laughing, and the person running the workshop observed my laughter and called attention to it in a generous way, because everyone was writing something down at the time. And I think that they were more like, like what made you laugh? And so I stood up and spoke it aloud. I'm like, yeah, I wrote down I'm going to have a podcast called Don't Cut Your Own Bangs. And the room erupted with laughter, all women. And it was all knowing laughter. So that's how the name of the podcast came to be. When I started the podcast, my goal was there were several goals. So I'll say it started with my goal was to have a podcast. Then when I started to learn what that actually meant, it was just a constant series of like learning what that actually meant, being terrified of the amount of work it would take, getting really sweaty and uncomfortable, and not working out sweat, like stress sweat, which is like really unflattering, smelly sweat. And then I would avoid thinking about it for a week. I'm basically explaining what happened between January and August when I published the first episode. So I wrote down I wanted to do it. I had no idea how to make that happen. Avoided it for like a week and a half. Then I called someone who I knew had a podcast. They connected me with someone who produced podcasts. I said, I think I want to have a podcast. And I said it out loud to another human being. Terrified, sweat, freaking out, very stressful email to write, avoided it for a week. Then she replied to me. And I was like, oh, fuck. Now she replied to me. Okay. She asked me to meet for coffee. We meet for coffee. And she asked me very seemingly easy questions at this point, but it was like, okay, this is the name of your podcast. What do you want it to be about? And I was like, oh yeah, that's something I should figure out. So what do you want it to be about? Who do you want to talk to? Like, just like the format. I hadn't thought about the format at all. And then she was like, by the way, these are the places you want to go to find music to download and license for your intro and theme. And these are like 2 places where you can host your podcast. I can't even tell you how many buckets of sweat. I was just like, this is really hard. This is really unfamiliar. This is scary. Oh dear God. Avoided it for a week or 2. It's just same soup reheated over and over of, I would realize what the next summit in the mountain was. And it was really uncomfortable. And I would let it be uncomfortable. And by let it be uncomfortable, I would avoid thinking about it. And then it would just sort of like gnaw at me a little bit. And so then I would pick up just a little piece. Like, well, let me listen to some of these free music tracks. And then I'd have to figure out, oh, I have to buy and license it. And then each step of the way, it's like I was never going to know how to do it all before doing it. And I think that was the most uncomfortable process for me, was that I had to allow myself to be in unfamiliar territory and keep inching my way forward. And that's how I navigated everything. But like once I got through the technical piece of it, finding the music, creating my graphic art, like if you go to iTunes or Spotify where my podcast is and you look at the ping, that actually I did by myself in Canva. And that's like one of my favorite things. Like some of the things like the name and that came super easy for whatever reason. And then there were other elements that felt like being trapped in a dream in slow motion. The core, I'll say like emotional, selfish desire for the podcast was that I wanted and needed to know that I wasn't the only one struggling to figure stuff out. And I felt silly, and just probably a better word for this, but I felt like just cold calling or emailing someone and asking to have a 15-minute phone call or meeting them for coffee to ask them uncomfortable questions. It just didn't feel right. Networking events in general don't feel good, but connecting with people feels great. This felt like a place where I could invite someone to having a conversation that I got to set the tone for, and I could directly cut through all the BS and just ask the questions I wanted to ask and get right to it. All the stuff that was hard and sweaty was the stuff I kind of had to get through to get to the thing I really wanted to do, which was have these conversations and then share them, because that's my other favorite thing. It's like, I love learning. And then once I learn something, I immediately want to turn and share it with people, because I think it just makes the learning more fun and exciting. The simple answer is I wanted to ask people very personal questions, but because they weren't my clients, I needed a reason, and the podcast became that reason. And then I love connecting ideas and things that excite me with other people that are also interested in them. And so the platform of podcasting really lent itself to that. But learning how to work with 2 microphones, I had a huge technical glitch. My mic couldn't get my microphone to work for this. And I've recorded 100 episodes and I couldn't figure out how to get my mic to work on your podcast. So like, there's always uncomfortable parts, I guess.
Yes. I love what you said about how a podcast is such a great medium for being able to have these conversations. I interviewed someone recently. Her podcast is all about cancer, and it's called The C Word. And so like having those difficult conversations with people who have been through similar instances and circumstances as her. And I was talking to another podcaster last night, and she was saying that she is generally such a curious person. She wants to ask people all the questions, but it's kind of weird sometimes to like walk up to someone in the store and be like, I see you have a scar on your hand. Where did that come from? Like, people are going to be like, lady, go away. Whereas like a podcast, you're like, come in. We're going to ask you all the crazy questions and get to know you. And especially with a topic like therapeutic things and like digging deep and getting into like some pretty interesting issues that are like, hey, guess what? Not you're not the only one dealing with that. I think a podcast is such a great medium to be able to utilize that. So glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. Because at the time, like the backstory of where my life was when I started it, I was transitioning, or started the podcast. I was transitioning from working as a ballroom dance instructor to starting working in private practice as a therapist, psychotherapist. And the only reason why I'm calling it psychotherapy is that over the years, if I don't define it as that, people usually will follow up with asking if I'm referring to either massage therapy or physical therapy. So that's just part of the reason why that language, just for anyone wondering, like, why does she keep saying that word? But I felt so out of place and insecure in like that, in the imposter syndrome coming in, like, who's going to take me seriously? I'm in grad school so late. I'm in grad school with people that are 10 years younger than me. Just all of the what ifs and unknowns of, betting on yourself and hoping that you can make something meaningful for your life. I was so insecure. And at the time I shouldn't say I was insecure like I'm not now, but at the time that where my insecurity lived was, can I do this? And because I didn't know how to answer that, that's usually what activates my anxiety, is when I'm hit with uncertainty and trying to answer questions that I can't know in my own mind. What I was able to do was connect with 10 people who created something or was in the process of creating something or who had accomplished something that I was impressed with. And then I would literally ask them, don't give me the before and after. Before and after has made me angry at that time in my life. I was like, fuck you and your weight loss journey. I want to know, when was it hard? Stop skipping over all the middle stuff. And I want to hear it. And so that was really the premise originally. I actually don't talk a whole lot in the first 10 interviews because I was really trying to soak up from these guests. Like, tell me how you got from point A to point Z, and don't skip B, C, and D, please. Like, please tell me. Yeah.
Yeah. I was on a podcast, I want to say it was last year, and she was like, so tell me about your entrepreneurial journey. And so you do give the highlights and like the summaries. And she was like, what did those first few months look like? Like, from going and charging $450 to launch a podcast to $4,000, where, like, how did that happen? And where does that, like, how did that journey happen? And so I think that it's so important to highlight those, especially as you're having conversations with people and like digging into things that are like your listeners want to know more. And I think that as human beings and as a society, those of us who are enlightened, we want to know more. We don't want the highlights. We don't want the, like, especially in the online space, we're starting to see more of like, okay, you have a Tesla and a private jet, and that's all great, but like, I'm not going to buy your $47 thing that's going to magically let that happen for me, because it's not how it works. So like, let's talk about what actually works, guys, please.
Well, and sometimes, right, those little nuggets, right, like a little handful of M&Ms as opposed to a whole slice of chocolate cake. Like, I am very active on social media, and sometimes those little bursts of inspiration or seeing a before and after can ignite some either excitement or enthusiasm to do something in your own right. I'm certainly not knocking that. And what I'm adding, though, is at that time in my life and now and for forever, I'm always more interested in the middle, because it's like we live in a novel, but we watch other people's movies. So it's like we know our internal struggles, the protagonist's dialogue, what they're thinking, feeling, what they're worried about. But then all we see is the action that other people take. And I probably became, what I know to be true now that I didn't know at the time is generally the advice we give is the medicine we need. And so I was advising clients and I earned my degree, but it was the medicine and healing I needed, which was to, get curious, keep learning. How do you figure out the hard stuff?
Yes, I love it. We met a few months after you launched your podcast, right? Mm-hmm. So you were a baby podcaster, and we met at a podcast conference. And I'm sorry to anyone who listens to this show and met me at that conference, because you are literally the only podcast that I listened to from that.
Oh, that's so nice. Oh my God.
Yeah, I get it. I remember getting your card and being like, don't cut your own bangs. I get it. That is fantastic. And I remember having a chat with you, connecting with you really well, and being like, I really like this chick. So like, I'm going to listen to her show. And I remember listening to it on my way to work and being like, nodding along to the conversation, laughing at parts, and just being like, these are real conversations. Why is nobody having these? You put your heart and your soul into your show. And I want to help you reach all of those potential listeners out there. That's why I'm excited to announce my upcoming podcast marketing workshop. It's about giving you practical tools to grow your audience. You'll learn the secrets to getting your podcast discovered, attracting your dream listeners, and boosting those download numbers. This workshop will be hosted live with a replay available on April 30th. You can sign up by going to galatimedia.com/workshop. Let's grow our podcasts together.
The thing that helped me get out of my way a little bit with the podcast and not overthink it is that it's not presentational in the best possible way, in the sense that unlike social media or selfies where like a camera comes out and everybody holds a different posture, there's a contraction in the body, breath is being held, like there's a certain level of awareness, external awareness that I just don't have, thankfully. And that's probably, again, another layer of my own work I need to continue to do, which is, why are you performing so much? But that's not what this podcast is about. I'll explore that on one of my episodes, I guess. But I think that's one of the things I loved about this format is I could really drop into having a real conversation, and I became less performative and less curated, for lack of a better word, maybe. Again, because that was one of those at this podcasting event, that was a real stretch for me. I was invited or encouraged to go from the woman who taught me everything about podcasting. And I just sort of blindly trusted her because she held me like this little baby bird through the first 25 episodes. And so she said, you really need to come. And I just said, okay. And I didn't really question it. But those types of events normally are not because you're introducing yourself a bunch and you're talking about what you do a bunch. And I think that what the reason why I didn't like it is not because of those types of events, but I think I was constantly confronting the imposter thing. Like, do I belong here? Like, what am I doing here? I'm brand new at this. I don't know anything about anything, but I met you, and that was incredible. I mean, what a gift from that. And like the name of my podcast, that was just one thing that continues to, and I really can't even give myself credit for. I don't know if that came from me or through, I don't know, but like, because I really didn't give it any thought. But every time I say it, it brings that knowing laughter, which tells me it's working. So
yes. It's so good. So you're talking, I love this whole, like, your journey has been so interesting because this is not something that people talk about a lot. And I know I added mindset in as one of the things that I want to talk about on this show, because I think that imposter syndrome is such a huge thing. There are hundreds of thousands of podcasts out in the world. Don't freak out, guys. But there are hundreds of thousands of them. The majority of them don't get past 7. And so if you can get past that, like, kudos, great. But also it just shows, like, there are probably more people who are like, you know, don't create a podcast, create a YouTube channel instead. Do you know how many YouTube channels there are versus podcasts? A lot more. So if you want to get into an industry where it's like, there's not a lot of people here, my voice can be heard, you can show up in your leggings or pajamas and just be you.
Yes.
Then a podcast is such a fantastic format to do that and to be able to just try something out. I was talking to someone recently, and she was saying that everyone around her is telling her, don't start a podcast, don't start a podcast, don't start a podcast. And I was like, I would address who you're hanging out with first.
Yep. Is this a friend or a friend of me? Well, because this isn't a direct quote. It's sort of a loose paraphrase of something that I heard Marie Forleo share, who, I'm assuming you probably have a lot of entrepreneurs and business owners who are listeners. So she created B School, which is this great online business class. And before I went to graduate school to become a therapist, I took B School because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I hoped I would learn it there. And I didn't, but I did figure this out, which, she has this saying that she closes all of her content with is the world, like there's that special something that only you have. And I know that sounds woo, but she put it in a context of, think about your favorite Italian restaurant, the place that makes the pasta and has the sauce the way you like it. How many Italian restaurants exist? I can count 5. I mean, I'm from Indianapolis and I live on the north side of the city, and I can think of 5 on my side of town that I like and that are good, but they're also all still here. They're all still running business. So for fear of someone else doing it or someone doing it better, if that's the hurdle or the obstacle keeping you from trying, I would really encourage you to do a little bit more digging, because I bet you that's not the reason. That seems like a real factual and logical reason. A lot of times our self-criticism presents as logic, and that feels like a fact that sort of is masking fear.
Yeah, 100% agree. And it can be fearful. Like, that's not to negate that there is real fear that can happen, like your buckets of sweat.
So much sweat. Oh my God, so much sweat. But to speak to the statistic of most podcasts don't make it past 7 episodes. Someone told me something very similar when I was thinking of starting a podcast, and her information was, I guess, not incorrect. At the time in 2018, I released my first episode, August 1st of 2018. She said, most podcasts don't make it past 5. I don't know if maybe the statistic has changed. She said, most podcasts don't make it past 5 episodes. And most podcasts that don't have a co-host don't last. I don't know if that's true or if it wasn't, but it was just me. I wasn't planning on having a co-host, but I did hear, okay, if they don't make it past 5, then I will have 7 episodes ready before I launch. And so that's kind of how I got over that hurdle. But and this is just how I did it. This isn't even a recommendation, but I didn't really tell people I was doing it until I already had a lot of those things figured out, because what I've learned about my creative process, and it's probably not unique to me, but I only know my experience through it, is that, and maybe it's because I've had a baby this year, but there's a reason why the baby is inside the womb in the early stages. It's because it's not safe to be out in the world yet. It can't sustain life outside of the body. And sometimes my ideas creatively are like that. They are so delicate, not any less alive or vital, but they're delicate, and they need to live in me a little bit longer before I'm ready to share them with the world, because the idea has enough shape and it's strong and it's clear enough in its existence that it can hold outside of me. Because what will happen, or has happened and still happens sometimes, is I'll get a spark of an idea, and then someone will not even criticize it or negate it, but they'll just ask me a question I don't know how to answer. Like, well, how much will that cost? Or how much time will it take? Or what do you want to do with it? Or why? Why do you want to do it? And sometimes I don't even know why. That can shut the idea down. Again, not because someone was trying to squash my dream, or not because the question wasn't a worthy question. I just wasn't at the right time in the process to handle that kind of question. And so I didn't really open up this podcast thing until I was ready. And I wasn't ready. The very first episode I recorded wasn't even, I didn't even call it an episode. It's labeled as a bonus track. If anyone wants to find it, it's labeled as the bonus track in season 1. And I was just, I'm using air quotes here, testing my audio equipment with my husband. And we were just shooting the shit with a glass of wine. I ended up releasing it just because I'm like, well, how can I talk about the messy middle and not share this? That would feel a little fraudulent. So yeah, but I had 5 episodes recorded before I released. And the more I kept doing it, the less fraudulent I felt and the less of an imposter I felt, but it took doing it.
Yeah, sometimes you just have to take that step and take action, messy action usually, and that's okay.
Yeah, that's a good word, messy action. I like that.
That is not my phrase. I don't know who said it.
It's good.
Somewhere.
I like it though.
It's very good. I love it so much. I like what you said about like things, like ideas having to sit with you for a minute and like understanding. I say this a lot, like know thyself, like know what works for you, know what your creative process is like. If you need to be able to test something out first and see if it's going to work, like to the woman who was like, everybody's telling me not to launch a podcast. I said, well, how do you want to? Are you creating consistent content for your audience? Do you know what your audience needs to hear? Like, these are questions that I typically tell people to ask themselves before they decide to launch a podcast. Also, newsflash, you don't have to do it forever.
Yeah.
Do a limited series. Like, say, hey, I'm going to do 15 episodes. It's going to be like, go into it. This is a limited series. It's an idea I want to test out. And if it keeps going, it keeps going. Yeah. But like, do it if you want to do it. Give it a shot. Try it out. I know I talk a lot of strategy on this podcast, but I also wholeheartedly believe in doing what works best for you as well. And yes, there are like step-by-step things you should do, but we're not always going to be able to do what we should be doing.
Well, and I will also share like some like full disclosure, like there were probably a lot of content, strategy, clarity things that I didn't know and or think about until episode 15. I was so excited to talk to people that's pretty much what the beginning was. And again, my motive was more to get information selfishly for myself. And I think probably what I told myself, I remember hearing this in theater school and of course, I don't know if it's true or not, but I heard it and it sounded good and it fit my narrative. So self-selection bias, please. Robert De Niro went into all of his auditions utterly convinced he wouldn't get any of them. And I know that doesn't really fall into maybe like a law of attraction mindset, but what it allowed him to do is it freed him from having to make a choice to be liked, and it allowed him to be bold in his choices in the audition because he wasn't concerned with getting it or not. And so for me in line with what you're saying, I think if I'd been too in my head about what I was recording, I may not have pressed record. Where I really needed the confidence was the format, the technology, the audio, because those were the areas where I felt inadequate. But also knowing myself, I have spent the better part of my life performing in one form or another, communicating, and then getting a degree in therapy. The conversation part wasn't something now that doesn't mean I haven't improved or shifted things or have a better understanding, but in the first 15 episodes, I didn't.
Yeah. I think there's two things that come up for me. One, in the very first interview I ever recorded for my very first podcast, you probably can't find it, but if you do, I asked a question that had nothing to do with my audience or the topic or whatever. And that is still in there. And so like, you don't know until you give it a shot. And to the Robert De Niro scenario and the story about him, I think there's a balance between law of attraction and being so tied to an end result that we hold ourselves back. And so I think that there's like this medium that we this line we have to walk between the two of being like, yes, the universe is going to give it to me. Also, I'm not attached to the end result of whatever the universe gives to me because then I'm going to want to control it. And then that's not good.
Well, because we don't know what the end is, really. It's like, and it makes me think a little bit about, again, I'm paraphrasing, not directly quoting Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic, The Art of Creative Living Beyond Fear, which if someone's in like the early gestational stages of a creative idea, I think that's a wonderful reference. She, again, loosely paraphrasing, talks about how the belief in what you're doing and that like the creative pursuit has to matter for you to push through, slogging through all of the shiitake mushrooms of it. And it also can't matter. Like you can't hold it too precious because then you won't make anything. And so there is that kind of like a seesaw of a balance of just wanting to hit enough in the middle to, letting yourself make mistakes and learn from them. And I think I kind of hijacked that process for myself a little bit because the podcast is about navigating mistakes essentially. But also at some point, especially now that I've made 100 episodes, I think there are some reasonable expectations for listeners to have about the quality of the questions. And like, I'm built a relationship and trust with people who listen. And so I can't be like, whoops a daisies, I just made a mistake. And, let something be like really poor quality. Cause then it's almost like a bait and switch, because it also is about learning. So hopefully that learning means improving.
Yes, for sure. Obviously, I could talk to you forever, but we're coming up on time. So if you could just tell everyone where they can find you, hang out with you, tag you on social and be like, hey, I heard you on the Listeners to Lead show.
So you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Danielle Ireland _LCSW. I'm pretty sure though, if you type in the search engine Danielle Ireland, I'm pretty sure I'm one of the top options. I'm not the only option, but Danielle Ireland _LCSW. My website, www.worldwideweb.danielleireland.com. And you can find me there. There's a place where you can directly send me a message, connect with me. You can also DM me on social media. And my podcast, Don't Cut Your Own Bangs, can be found on iTunes and Spotify.
Awesome. And we will have links to all of that in the show notes. So if anyone is driving or needs them later, you can always find those there, unless you're on Apple Podcast. Boo for Apple Podcast, and there are no hyperlinks. Yes. I've talked about it on the show before. I have so much angst for Apple Podcasts. Anyway, thank you so much, Danielle, for coming on this show.
So glad to be here. Thanks for everyone who listened. Yeah, this was a blast.
Awesome. Talk soon. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.